You have joined the Human Trafficking Focus on Labor Law program, which we will again start in just a minute. Welcome. So happy to see you. So happy to see so many of you today. I can promise you, when we were preparing, I was looking at the slides, you are going to be so thrilled, I think, with this program. It is so informative and a very, very strong and direct look at labor trafficking. And I'm not going to say anything more because that's part of my introduction, but welcome everyone. It's really great to have you.
There are a few more people joining.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, we'll just wait for everyone who has signed up to come into the room. And absolutely, if you all would like to, feel free to be on video. We will not, you will be muted throughout the program, but you will be able to interact with us in the chat. So, so we'll get going in a second on that. Eddie, it looks like we've got more people still coming in. This is great. Welcome, everyone.
More people are signing on. So
okay, we'll hang on then. We'll hang on for a few more minutes. We'll let everyone in. Oh my goodness, I'm seeing so many familiar names and faces. It's great to have so many friends joining us again. Once more, we're doing this online, but it is really great to see people who've been here in the past when we've done this in person. And now here you are online again. So thank you so much. We're going to wait about another couple of minutes. It looks like we've got many more people joining us. This is great. So thank you. Looks like we have a lot of folks from the law school. Of course, this is wonderful to have you all with us. Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. We have folks still joining us, so we're going to let everyone into the Zoom room here and start in about a minute. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today during National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. It's one of our official programs that we're doing as part of the observation of this important month. So thank you all for joining. Okay, it looks like we've got about 3 after, and Eddie, I will leave it to you to let people in and proceed with getting more folks who want to join us to do that. But let's go ahead and start our program today. I'd like to welcome all of you. My name is Robin Hassler Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. This is one of many programs that, or STAC, this is one of the many programs that STAC works together with many in the community to sponsor and and put out there for us, especially this month of January, as I mentioned, with us looking at National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. It's really an honor to be here again doing this program with the FSU College of Law. I need to thank in particular Dean Erin O'Hara O'Connor. She has been a great and strong supporter of this program for some time now. And also Catherine Miller and Eddie Meyer, who's helping us today with all of our tech issues. Thank you so much. Also, as I mentioned this, let me just tell you, my job is going to be a moderator today. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about human trafficking and labor trafficking in our area. And then we'll turn it over to our wonderful panel. And I know you're going to agree that they're terrific. But as I'm doing that, I just wanted to mention that we are recording this program, and this will be posted on the STAC website at surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. I'll put that later in the chat, so that you'll know that if you wanted to share this later with any of your folks, any of your colleagues, know that it will be available later as well. Also, you'll notice in the chat, we have put a lot of information up there. These are all things that I really encourage you all to click on download now. As our speakers talk about those issues, we'll be repeating them so you can make sure you get all the latest resources. I'd also like to thank Legal Services of North Florida. Thanks to them, this is a program that will be available for 2 hours of general CLE credit with the Florida Bar. And I'll be giving you all that information about how you get your CLE credit in Florida at the end of the program. Okay, so what I'd like to do right now is briefly to introduce our panel and let you know that we do have a I want to say all-star, star-studded in the trafficking world, but the people who have done this work and have been doing this work to support survivors of human trafficking for quite some time. And because we have so much information to share with you, what we all agreed to do as a panel is to let you know that in the chat, which I will put in a second, we have everybody's full bios, and they're really excellent. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you in just a sec. But let me let you know who's with us today. First, Martina Vandenberg, who is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center in Washington. But it is a global concern. And I will tell you, Martina, it's so wonderful to be working with you again. Martina has presented in person at this very program in the past, and it's just an honor and joy to have you with us again today. I'd also like to introduce you all to Finus Lapinga, who is a training advisor to the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Finus, I've seen you from afar for a long time, and I'm just so honored to be working with you and to doing this work today with you on this panel. So welcome. Also from the FSU College of Law, we have Danica Harley, who is now a clinical professor, or as of August, Danica, at the FSU College of Law. Danica has also, I want to say, is a returning champion. Watched too much Jeopardy. Danica has presented at these programs at least twice, and it is really an honor to have you on our panel today. Also, two wonderful students, and I believe you also have been part of our program before. Melody Andrews is a College of Law student, third-year student, as is Peyton Smith, both of whom have been very, very active in this issue of anti-trafficking work within the law school and the community. And I can tell you that you've been extremely important to us at STAC as we've done our work. I also want to acknowledge Paulo Anino. Professor Anino, I can see that you're with us today. Your leadership and guidance at the law school with these wonderful students in this program is really, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done all the years and our collaborations together. So Paulo, it's great that you're with us today. I'm going to take just a couple minutes right now and give you a little bit of information about our program. I'll also be trying to monitor the chat. As I said, you will not be able to speak during this program. We've got everybody on mute, but we do want to hear your questions and your comments in the chat. So please do that throughout the program. We do have the opportunity to address any technical issues. Eddie is on with us, so know that we can do that as well if you're having any questions. We also have the ability to have this as a live transcript. If you would like to view this with closed captioning, you can click on that at the bottom ribbon of your screen and have that available for you. So let me start out at the top and just tell you what STAC is, who the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center is. In February, we will be 7 years old. We are here in the North Florida area where we've been working to both support labor trafficking and sex trafficking survivors and those at risk of being trafficked. And it's regardless of age, regardless of immigration status. That is our first and really important mission, is to do that direct case management work with survivors. And the way we do that is, of course, in collaboration with our many partners and others in the community. We also provide direct case management and assistance, and have really been focusing the last couple of years with an outreach into our rural areas. I guess my fake background here, you can see that this is a view of Tallahassee, which is not necessarily very rural looking, but we do have 5 other counties surrounding us, and we do work in that area. We work to do community education, both specifically and in larger groups. So please know that we're available to assist you with that. You've seen that today's program is a focus on labor trafficking, and we couldn't be happier to be doing this program. The issue of labor trafficking is one that very often falls under the radar. Of course, the words human trafficking involve both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but very often, whether it's the popular press or the media, what we see is an emphasis on sex trafficking, sometimes to the detriment of people even understanding that there is something called labor trafficking. We know that for both human trafficking in general, that this is, of course, an incredibly lucrative field. What we know, and we don't know everything because it's so hidden, is more than 40 million people worldwide are trafficked, and it is at least $150 billion industry. You should know too that Florida is 3rd in the nation in terms of the number of calls for both sex and labor trafficking that come into our national human trafficking hotline. Now, a couple of basics about trafficking that will be expanded upon more in by our panelists. Please know that there's in the law a distinction between sex and labor trafficking, both in Florida and federal law. Sex trafficking refers to victims who are exploited for the purposes of any kind of commercial sex, including pornography, prostitution, illicit massage, door-to-door brothels, etc. They can be of any gender, any race, any age, and are increasingly recruited and exploited online, particularly during the pandemic. And know that too, that really since the pandemic, what we've seen is both reports here in Florida. We heard just from DCF the other day, as well as online, that those numbers have been really climbing. Sex trafficking technically is the exploitation of a person, as I said, for a commercial sex act that it's induced by force, fraud, and coercion, or in which the person induces is under the age of 18. You do not have to prove force and fraud or coercion. And by that, I mean that if the person is a minor, the law deems that they cannot consent to committing one of these acts. Similarly, for labor trafficking, it's the exploitation of a person for labor or services through the use, again, of force or fraud or coercion. Under the federal law, please know that you do have to show force or fraud or coercion if the individual is an adult or a minor. But in Florida, we actually are quite progressive, and you do not have to show that. Again, the law deeming a minor unable to consent to performing a labor or service and being exploited, of course. Understand too, for force, fraud, and coercion, that force does indicate things like physical constraints and other kinds of abduction or injuries. Fraud is really about promises broken, lies, any kind of if you will, coercion or whether it's written or verbal. And then coercion is often seen as threats, and we'll talk more about how that looks as we go through our panel. Estimates up to 75% are that labor trafficking is all of human trafficking. In other words, Between 40 and 75% of all human trafficking is deemed labor trafficking, and many goods are made with forced labor of both children and adults, and we're going to talk about that more. On a local note, let me wrap up with this. STAC's caseload right now tripled at the outset of the pandemic. The numbers of survivors that we're supporting in collaboration with our partnerships has grown. And over half of our caseload is labor trafficking survivors. We know that this is a very serious issue, and yet we're kind of have a steep learning curve, I think, in our area, because we haven't had any prosecutions. We've had some in Jacksonville, we've had some west of here in the Destin area, but we're really looking forward to seeing more labor trafficking arrests and prosecutions and investigations. And we see that there's really a growth and improvement in that area, thanks to both the work of TPD, Tallahassee Police Department, and Sheriff Walt McNeil's recent establishment of an anti-trafficking unit within the Leon County Sheriff's Office. So all this is to say we're looking forward to really having more information, more knowledge in our community about labor trafficking, regardless of whether you're law enforcement, healthcare, the business community, et cetera. And this panel today is going to help us know even more. So what I'd like to do right now is I'm going to be your moderator. I'm going to turn off my microphone and turn it immediately over to Finest Lapinga as I share the screen and we get ourselves going. So thanks, y'all. Great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me again to the next page. Next slide, please. Human trafficking were the bridge to justice, first of all. Labor trafficking, don't even make me started. Next, please. I was brought to the United States by my trafficker diplomat from Malawi to Washington, D.C., work at Malawi Embassy. And let's pause here. When you talk about labor, when you talk about human trafficking, what comes in people's mind at first, what? Their mind just think about sex trafficking and this child exploitation, because that's the message we have out there. So people are misinformed. You left the other type of human trafficking behind, trapped like the way I was. Lately there's more than 25 types of human trafficking. Next, please. I came to this country legally, as you can see, with a free visa, so I did not jump. I signed the contract. Well, go back for a free visa. As you know, you are in law school, so you might be familiar already. If you don't know, every visa, this visa is the visa that is granted to domestic workers who came here with the Diplomat or World Bank. But the problem with this visa, when people come to the other country, domestic worker, that means when they are trapped, they cannot leave. If they leave, they will face consequences. That means they will be kicked out, they will lose their status, and they are out from the country. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I signed the contract, and the contract was written in English. I could not understand and read English at the time. Next slide, please. I landed in this beautiful country, and I was living in this nice, beautiful neighborhood, first class, as you can see, clean, no trash on the floor. But I was trapped in this house for 3 years. My trafficker, when we get here, she changed to the tiger. She wasn't the first person I had known. She was a different person. I was working long hours with time off. I wasn't exposed to outside the world. I was trapped. I was working more than 17, 8 hours a day. I was cleaning, ironing every single clothes. I was threatening all the time. My trafficker was telling me that when Alana was reported me to authority, I did not understand. She was telling me that she's still paying for my air ticket. I did not understand that I have to pay her back because she never tell me. That's not the problem, because the problem is the cars, and the cars was driving up and down in this like beautiful neighborhood to see me wearing like, not proper clothes for the weather, shoveling the, blizzard of snow in the driveway, and they never stop, like they never look at my eyes and stop and ask me what is wrong. Not only that, the police officer actually was just next to us, but even that police officer saw me like doing like landscaping, gardening, like around, but like still not wearing proper clothes. And that police officer never like even asked me what is wrong. And people are coming to the house. So Malawi, when we party. It's from 6 to 6. We don't play with parties. So that means I have to serve people, cook. I can cook. Yeah, I have to prepare food for the party. Then people, they get drunk and dance, and I have to continue making breakfast in the morning because we don't leave. But still you can invite them to the party because you love to party. But people are coming to the house, as I said, even drinking. But people like they never. Next, please. Next slide, please. They never say anything. We talk about red flag. Red flags was there. I was the first, the last person eating in the house, and I was eating like by the corner in the kitchen after everybody ate. I was tried for 3 years, getting paid 0 to 40 cents an hour in America. Who can buy candy even like with 40 cents? Like I felt like a slave because I said I felt like slave in this house because in America, you treat pets like dogs and animals like human beings, because this is why you take your pets in the vet at the vet, but it wasn't my case. I developed a lot of medical conditions that never been treated. Some of them like scars, like my teeth. These are not my teeth because I lost my teeth because I wasn't able to receive health care. So I suffered mentally, sexually, emotionally when I was in this house. And also I was forced to sleep in the basement because my trafficker told me that I cannot sleep upstairs because I'll make the family continuity. So imagine I wasn't allowed to use simple essential like toothbrush, toothpaste. That's why I end up my teeth are like messed up. Next slide, please. On top of like working in the house, actually, my trafficker partner owned a business, like it's 200 degrees, it's still operating 200 degrees. I was working in a DMV area, cleaning like industrials, this heavy machine. And behind you have to like carry like heavy gear to do this heavy machine. And remember, when I was working there, my trafficker was not only not feeding me, but like I was malnourished. I was manually so working. That means I was working on the clock without paid, like next without getting paid. I talk about like red flags already. Next slide, please. I talk about, people coming to the house, drinking, shoveling the snow, all this, like, look at my face. They never like, I believe like when you go outside, like, I don't know how people were blind. Every system failed me. The system failed me, terribly. When I say the system failed me, it failed me. Next slide, please. My trafficker every time was telling me that when Alana, she reported me to authority because she's a diplomat, she cannot get in trouble. So one day my trafficker came home and they were drunk. This garage here, when you open it always creak, and when you close it always also creak down. So that day, one day, my trafficker came home and I did not hear the garage creak. So I stole my passport and my contract. By the way, when I found my contract later, I discovered that I was supposed to get paid $980 a month versus 0 to 40 cents, an hour. So I fled for my life. And I wanted to die. I didn't want to die in this house because the way my traffic was treated, I thought like when I died, didn't care about me. When I died, gonna dump me in the dumpster. So I wanted to die in the street or in the butchers. I thought like people would find me eventually. Because I saw when I was babysitting, not only I was babysitting only the kids for my trafficker, there was other diplomat kids. I was just like, babysitting multiple kids without even getting paid. Even, transfer to family diplomat to cook, to host when they are hosting party in their homes. So when I ran away, next please. when I ran away, I didn't know that, of course, I was a victim, but I stood up. But after observing, like learnings happened to other people and explain that I was a victim, I stood up because, next please, especially after I understand the meaning of like immunity, I was so, that really stick with me up this day, and it was bothering me because I wanted to really know, because it was every day my traffic was using the word is immunity. I cannot go anywhere, I ran away. And by the way, my traffic was like videotaping me, so monitoring pretty much. And also there was no communication between and my family for 3 years because she was disconnecting the phone. So I took my trafficker to court. I won $1.1 million, but unfortunately, and of course, I won because of like that time I went to another organization like nonprofit in Castle of Maryland, and they gave me the number. I called, and it was American University, and American took my case. So it was my personal lawyer, Megan Haskins, who reached out to trying to find the organization, NGO, to take my case, which was challenging because people didn't want to take my case because, again, diplomat, it went to fight, makes sense. That's what give me energy to keep fighting. So next, please. Even though I did not get the money, 1.1 million that I was rewarded by the judge, this of Maryland, I am still fighting. My lawyer is still fighting for it, but like for me, justice more than that, because as I said, justice, I got my voice. Now I have this platform, I can speak and I can address those areas that failed me. Not only that failed me, the system failed me terribly. Next slide, please. Recommendation. We have to invest in policies. I know United States had made a lot of changes because there's now, check-in program that people from the government visit domestic workers in their home who came with diplomat like me, and also World Bank. So they have resources started in Washington, DC, and also we are able to make that pass in New York. But apart from that, also we have to prosecute labor trafficking so we can have our day in court. Because my case, I never had a day in court, because what happened is when my trafficker fled the country, she was promoted to ambassador of Zimbabwe and Botswana. So that means it's hard to collect the money. So we need, when we come out, you need to prosecute labor trafficking cases. And there's some other policies that has, my case like helped to change a lot of policies. For example, checking program. And also I testify like 2019 in my own state, there was labor statute wasn't a crime in Maryland, but I stood up, I testified in the district of Maryland, Annapolis, and like labor statute is a crime in Maryland for first time. Next, please. Another recommendation for that, for the police, we need to protect all types of visa, not only a free visa. We need to protect all types of free visa, types of free visa, because otherwise people keep getting trapped in the houses. So every A5 in all types of visa need to be protected. So we need to put the policy that will protect all the workers. Trauma. When you talk about trauma, don't divide us. Most of the time, people, when like they treat us, they think like, labor trafficking, like maybe, it's not a waste, but like, believe me or not, when it comes to PSD, there's no blue or white. We all have to do with the trauma. Mental health awareness should be top priority for all survivors for labor, sex, trafficking, regardless of their age, gender, and background. If you have no experienced trauma in your life, it's hard to maintain physical well-being. Moving forward, I would like to see a world where mental health gains the same status as in other physical alignments. For example, I was in the hospital after I escaped, and like I say more than a month, but that hospital medical care did not identify me as a victim. I know English, it wasn't my language. It was hard to communicate, but like they should read body language. Read body language. Don't just rely on somebody to talk. Read body language. I was crying. I was saying like different things. I didn't want to go where I was trafficked. There's not on top of that. My trafficker come and visit me in the hospital. That put me in danger. So if they communicate with me, my trafficker wouldn't have to visit me in the hospital. Remember, she was saying like, when you learn, I'm gonna find authority, gonna find you. Yes, so I was scared. What do you think? I was in danger. Next slide, please. Whew. This is my favorite topic. Labor trafficking may not speak English and as their first language, like my case. Again, in my case, when I was in the treatment again under medical, when I said the system failed me, I can call it like I can scream. I remember they put me in the room and they did not explain to me what was happening. And before I know it, 6 gentlemen walking in the room wearing these gears, and I was tiny. And before I know it, there's another person behind the wall, and that person behind the wall was speaking English and my language, Chichewa. I was scared, and I was scared with the people who were in the room. Those 6 gentlemen, they are close to FBI. I didn't know that they were law enforcement. I didn't know that the other person behind the wall was interpreter, because I wish they could explain to me, sit down with me, explain to me what interpreter is. My English was very, very limited. Imagine, they did not explain to me what interpreter is. They did not those people who came, the law enforcement, did not introduce themselves to me. They did not introduce the person who was speaking the other side of the wall. The problem wasn't only that the person who was speaking behind the wall, the interpreter. No, the problem was that interpreter sounding exactly like my trafficker. Seriously, that interview, you know what happened? They did not get what they want. Law enforcement did not get what they want that time. Things did not turn out well. That interview started, last less than 2 minutes because I was scared to my life. The person interpreter sounded like my trafficker. I believe that was my trafficker because the voice was the same. Then I have law enforcement in front of me, sick law, so I thought they are there to arrest me. So we have to be careful. And I'm gonna just add another point for recommendation for a language. And years ago, I sent an email to my law firm. So my personal reached out to the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Human Trafficking Legal Center referred my case to the big law firm in DC, Jones Day. So they took my civil cases. So I sent an email to my lawyers at Jones that, hey, I've been here in this country. I think it's time for me to apply for citizenship. So they respond to the email. They say, unfortunately, listen, unfortunately, we're not gonna be the one who's gonna help you, but we're gonna find somebody else. For me, my mentality with like my understanding English, my law communication with English, I was focused with the unfortunately, we are not the one. So my brain was like, oh my gosh, I freaked out. Oh my God, they leave me. I was crying. I was so stressed. My PTSD was up. I was crying. I couldn't eat for the 3 weeks. I met Martina. I was like, what are you doing? How are you doing? I said, I'm not doing well. She said, what's wrong? I was like, well, because I get because I get an email from my lawyer. They said they cannot be my lawyers anymore. Martina was like, what are you talking about? So I pulled up my phone and email to show her the line. She was like, no, finance. What they mean is, what this means is that lawyers, we have categories. Some lawyers, they focus with like accidents. Some lawyers, they focus with like immigration. Some lawyers focus with civil cases. So in this case, your lawyers, they are not good in this, this area, but instead they're gonna find somebody else. They did not leave you, but they are trying to find another lawyer who's good at doing this, like application help you this. So I was like, okay, do you know how much that it tossed me to the mental state? Next, please. So again, communication. And also you have to you have to discuss with your client the way they wanted to be communicating, whether email or text, because some people email, again, can be not good communication for them. They might prefer like a text or just a phone call. It depends the way they, communicate with like you. And also like when you are with your client, please give them time, give them a break. And like when you are doing interview, trying to learn their stories, don't force them, because it's triggering. And also my case, I want to like add this, when law school was working with me, it's law school. That means when the semester is closed, I have to start working with the lawyers from summer, spring. So telling stories over and over is traumatizing. So what I'm trying to say is, when you have like your client, try to stick with them all the way. Don't switch because it's so draining. Next slide, please. Again, homeless can be both the root cause of and results of human trafficking. Survivors are often confront homelessness. My case, when I was discharged from the hospital, still instead of like, connect me to social services, I was dropped to homeless shelter, and this homeless shelter wasn't trauma-informed at all. So we have to invest in housing. Next, please. I know I have 5 minutes. Survivors, we are leaders. It doesn't feel good to always be someone else's mess, but how can we all bring back to dignity for survivors, their life, so that we are not always at the mercy of the system? You need to start collaborating with partners, education, instructions, vacation training, to create an education scholarship to all survivors, regardless of our background. So we are leaders. What happened to me doesn't define me. Here's my motto: nothing about us without us.
Thank you so much, Finest, and thank you for your courage and for sharing your experiences and wisdom and knowledge with us today. There are so many lessons that you lived and are continuing to share. I wish we had more time to hear more from you. Let everybody know that we did not have any questions come in during your presentation, but that if you do have some, Finest will be available to answer those questions at the conclusion of our program, toward the conclusion of our program. So Finest, thank you so much. All right, now I'd like to introduce Professor Danica Harley, Peyton Smith, and Melody Andrews to talk about all the good work that's going on at the FSU College of Law in this arena. Danica?
Thank you so much, Robin. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to be here today, to be a part of this important and necessary conversation. Finest, I just want to say thank you so much for your strength and your willingness to share with us your story and to really emphasize the importance of centering survivor voices. I really just want to say thank you for your time here today. I have the honor of being joined today by Peyton Smith and Melody Andrews, who are both 3L students at the College of Law. We work within the Public Interest Law Center. Both Peyton and Melody are past students of our Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Project. Through the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Project, or HELP as we call it, we provide direct pro bono assistance to children survivors of trafficking or children who are at risk of being trafficked. In addition to that, we also provide community trainings and legal presentations on various trafficking issues, as well as working to implement and utilize strategies to combat the use of forced labor in the supply chain globally. Next slide, please. So today, through our presentation, we'll be focusing on a couple of things. We'll provide a brief overview of some of the framework that's currently available to use supply-side remedies against labor trafficking. We'll also look at the process of petitioning through Section 307 of the US Tariff Act and what that all entails. We'll detail some recent enforcement actions, which I know one of our fellow presenters, Ms. Martina Vandenberg, will elaborate more on, as well as lastly, discussing some of the strategic implications that come with use of these tariff petitions. Next, I will pass it on to Peyton Smith.
Hi, I'm Peyton Smith, as Danica introduced. I want to take a second and recognize that in an increasingly interconnected world, that has led to complicated supply chains across the globe. And we have to sit here and ask ourselves, what's the human cost of increasing the consumer demands for fresh produce, fast fashion, flashy gadgets? For those people that are held in forced labor, what do their conditions look like? What remedies exist for the victims? And what can we as advocates do to hold these corporations and individuals accountable for the labor trafficking they use in their supply chains? The International Labor Organization estimates there are 25 million victims of forced labor across the globe, with almost 4 million of these being children. If these numbers are correct, that means there's more slaves today than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. These people are both women and men, and they're all across the globe. Next slide, please. The United States is the leading global importer of goods at risk of being produced through forced labor. They spend $144 billion of money on goods made using forced labor. That's 3 times that of the second placeholder, Japan, at $47 billion, and 10 times that of the third placeholder, Canada, at $15 billion. An American historian, David Bryan, eloquently said, and I love this quote, "We must face the ultimate contradiction that our free and democratic society is made possible by massive slave labor." Next slide, please. At the Public Interest Law Center, we've had the opportunity to advocate for change on 2 goods that are at risk of forced labor: cocoa and seafood. First, with cocoa, big chocolate companies get away with a lot. They pay $1.59 a kilo for what market value should be $8.38 a kilo of cocoa. What makes up for this glaring cost discrepancy? Well, it's 30,000 forced laborers and 1.5 million child laborers on the Ivory Coast that pick the cocoa, that plant the cocoa, that produce the cocoa that we eat and we see on the shelves every day. Children are first to use dangerous machetes, spray toxic pesticides, and carry 100-pound sacks of cocoa that are just too large for their developing bodies. On the rare occasion they are paid, on average it's 85 cents a day. As Phanis mentioned earlier, the wages of those stuck in labor trafficking are nowhere enough to live on. Next slide, please. The seafood industry is also very interesting and very at risk. We import over $9.5 billion worth of seafood from Southeast Asia. Only 13% of this seafood is tracked. That means 87% is at risk of forced labor. There have been cases of children as young as 5 forced to work 12-hour days, 7 days a week on ships for years off the coast of Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. These are by far not the only industries. There was a recent subcommittee hearing in the US Senate which addressed forced labor issues. Witnesses from nonprofits testified that over 70 countries and 150 products supplied from places that had forced labor. Some of these other problematic products are palm oil from Malaysia, cobalt and sugar from the Dominican Republic of the Congo, rubber plantations in Liberia, melon farms in Honduras, garment workers in Haiti, cotton from Turkey, and electronic products from Chinese re-education camps. A lot of this we have in our own homes and we see on the shelves every day. As Phanis' story shows, forced labor isn't just something that happens abroad that we ship in. Forced labor is close to home. 1 in 800 people in the United States may be a victim of labor trafficking. Top domestic labor trafficking industries are domestic housework, construction, manufacturing, farming, and fishing. Immigrants are especially susceptible to being labor trafficking victims because of particular vulnerabilities in their migration. Next slide, please. The United States currently has several national and international obligations that are designed to prevent goods produced from forced labor from entering the United States. We've been legislating against this issue since 1789 with the Alien Tort Claims Act and the Geneva Convention. The most recent legislation, Next slide, please, sorry. The most recent legislation was the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which entered into force on July 1st, 2020. It calls on several federal agencies to take action against the forced labor crisis. The Department of Trade, Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, and Department of Labor. If you look up the USMCA under Chapter 23, it specifically prohibits forced labor. There's calls for minimum wages, regulation of hours, safety and health considerations, mandatory on-site inspections, training of inspectors, and sanctions for such violations. It also sets up tribunals that are supposed to be transparent and information sharing that's supposed to be readily accessible and publicly available whenever we're looking through these processes. In the Public Interest Law Center, we're looking at ways to accessing those tribunals and setting up petitions because there's obviously goods coming into the US that are coming from forced labor. Looking at this timeline really opens up your eyes to this has been a problem throughout time and we're still attacking it in new and inventive ways. I'd like to hand it over to Professor Danica Harley to talk about the petition process of Section 307 of the US Tariff Act and recent enforcement actions.
Thank you, Peyton. As Peyton mentioned, through looking at supply side remedies for the use of forced labor, there's the opportunity to petition through what is known as the US Tariff Act of 1930. That Tariff Act prohibits the importation into the United States of any goods made wholly or in part using forced, indentured, or even convict labor in any part of the world. Today, I'll focus on the use of Section 307 as it pertains to the prevention of goods made from forced labor. U.S. Customs and Borders Patrol, or the CBP, enforces this prohibition through the U.S. Tariff Act. CBP has the power to issue what's known as a withhold release order, or WRO, to prevent, please go back to the previous slide. Thank you. To prevent importation, to prevent imports from entering the United States if there is a suspicion that forced labor was used in the production or processing of the goods. Those goods that are subject to an WRO will be detained at all US ports, and goods subject to WROs are withheld from release and prohibited from entering the US. Now, what's important to look at is the definition of forced labor under Section 307. The Tariff Act defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty for its non-performance and for which the worker does not offer himself voluntarily. Essentially, that establishes two key elements for the definition and satisfying the proof for forced labor. Those two elements are the menace of penalty and non-voluntariness. Menace of penalty refers to a range of penalties that are used to compel someone to work, whereas involuntariness refers to the absence of a free and informed consent on the part of the worker. For conditions of forced labor to be established, the evidence must substantiate that both menace of penalty and involuntariness are present. Next slide. Thank you. So next, I'll give an overview of what this application process looks like. Next slide. Anyone may submit info to the Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, on the use of forced labor at any stage of manufacture, processing, or mining of goods imported in the US. So it's important to recognize that it's not just limited to particular organizations, NGOs, or what have you. That petition shall contain and is required to contain a full statement of the reasons for the belief that the goods are made with forced labor, detailed description or sample of the merchandise, and then all pertinent facts that are obtainable as to the production of the merchandise abroad. While specific shipment and product info is helpful, failure to not provide it is not dispositive, as the Customs and Border Patrol has access to its own databases for those to investigate into the allegations. At minimum, though, petitioners should provide as much information as possible to help the CBP identify a good through its internal databases. That could be information such as a physical description or production means, sourcing information, location of the product, or even the producer itself. I want to recognize it may be difficult to gain some direct victim testimony due to the hostile nature of either the government or potential delay and the opportunity or fear of retaliation. And in that case, petitioners can supplement their application through use of creative means like aerial photography or satellite imagery, even videos obtained through social media. I also want to recognize that secondary corroborating evidence like reports from international organizations or US agencies or even investigative media can be beneficial in supplementing that report. Right now, I do want to recognize that under the Tariff Act, the evidentiary threshold is admittedly low. Really, the standard for proving that there is forced labor is based on reasonableness. Petitioners only need to submit evidence that is reasonable, but not conclusive, to prove the prevalence of forced labor. And that standard is lower than the standard for credible evidence or probable cause. Next slide. So upon receipt, the CBP will review the information to ensure it meets the regulation standards. Just a receipt of that petition isn't sufficient to trigger a withhold release order. If adequate evidence of forced labor is present, it will likely trigger a more comprehensive investigation by the agency, which includes fact-finding and potentially the CBP reaching back out to the petitioner. This typically takes 6 months or more, depending on the nature of that investigation. And petitioners have the opportunity to seek an update, but may not gather much information from the agency as it's limited what the agency can share. Next slide. And so then we get to the point of commissioner review. Ultimately, it is the commissioner's determination of whether or not the CBP will actually detain merchandise. Next slide. Upon the determination of that commissioner's approval, we then find that a WRO has been issued. Now, shipments subject to a WRO are detained at the US border in accordance with the parameters. Affected companies have typically two options. They can either try to re-export the detained shipments to another port outside the United States, or they can contest the WRO within 3 months. Now, in order to obtain a release of the detained goods into the United States, that importer has 90 days to provide evidence of the goods origin and to show due diligence efforts to determine that goods were not produced with forced labor. So that might look like a supply chain audit report or a similar documentary evidence. At this point though, really it is on the importer to be the one to either export, contest, or protest. Next slide. If ultimately in the course of the investigation, a finding is published, it would be published in the Federal Register through the CBP. That subject merchandise will not be released from CBP custody and shall be treated as an importation that's prohibited under 19 USC section 1307. And then next slide. So then lastly, following the finding the filing and publishing of that finding comes the judicial forfeiture proceedings. The CBP will initiate those judicial forfeiture proceedings, and ultimately from there, that WRO is essentially codified, and any future opportunities for redress will need to be handled on appeal. Next slide. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the scope regarding recent enforcement actions I want to recognize. I'm focusing particularly from about March 2016 to 2020. As I know, Ms. Martina Vandenberg will be speaking more in depth about some of the more recent enforcement actions as well. We do know, though, that CBP issued a total of 15 WROs of different goods within the forced labor stream, and that 7 of those were issued just in 2019 alone. Next slide. And so here in this map provided by the Human Trafficking Legal Center, you get a better sense of what the geographic scope of these products and the nature of these products. That there's not just one particular type of production or production field or capacity that these products stem from. You'll see that they come from many different industries and unfortunately touch on many different areas of goods that are imported into the US. Next slide. Some of the most common and frequently identified indicators of forced labor that have been articulated in withhold release orders include the following. And you may see that this is very similar to the language that is used and identified by the International Labor Organization. And so we see forced labor, excessive hours, isolation. These are all things that petitioners would want to make sure that they can speak to and can articulate when submitting their petition. I do want to recognize also that the petitions that are submitted may be submitted either through a petitioner themselves, or it can be self-initiated by the CBP. So there are different means of access with that regard. And next, I would like to pass to Melody Andrews, who will be speaking more about some of the strategic implications that come along with petitioning through Section 307.
Thank you, Professor. As Professor Harley said, I would like to address some strategic implications and strategy using a Section 307 petition to supplement a larger anti-trafficking campaign. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that the US Tariff Act is a good starting point, but it does have its limits. So as Professor Harley mentioned, goods might be blocked from entering the United States, but they could be re-exported to other places. Using a 307 petition as part of a bigger anti-trafficking campaign can help improve outcomes. So in addition to utilizing a 307 petition, it's important to advocate for legislative changes, work with workers for the best outcome and include their voices into the campaign, and listen to workers and amplify their stories. Additionally, considering a public versus private campaign is important. So while awareness is important, and we see that through social media campaigns, it's also important to be aware of safety considerations for workers when advancing these type of campaigns. Working behind the scenes to put pressure on corporations to not buy goods made with forced labor can also be a useful approach. Next slide, please. So you want to be aware of how an WRO impacts workers and then have a plan to prevent harm. For example, there was a WRO issued against a manufacturer in Malaysia, and the manufacturer was not paying its workers. When the WRO was issued, the manufacturers received financial assistance specifically in order to pay what they owe to their workers. Additionally, you can push for mandatory supply chain disclosures and support transparency in supply chains. So mandatory supply chain disclosures would require greater transparency from companies. For instance, fish has been incredibly difficult to trace supply chains, and there's often labor trafficking involved. A mandatory supply chain disclosure would allow for traceability from the grocery store to the ship where the fish was caught, helping shine a spotlight on fishing practices. Next slide, please. We also want to talk about other ways to help. We recognize that not everyone is able to file federal petitions, so we wanted to give other suggestions for things that people can do. Next slide, please. One thing you can do is buy fair trade. So you can look for the fair trade logo that's at the top right of the slide and commit to buying those types of products. One product that we at PILC advocate for buying is Tony's Chocolonely. Tony's Chocolonely has, even on their packaging, when you open their chocolate bar, it talks about child slave labor within the chocolate companies, and Tony's Chocolonely's mission to eradicate slave labor from the chocolate industry. Additionally, Ethical Bean Coffee is a coffee company that puts a QR code on their packages, so you'll be able to trace where your coffee beans come from with the quick use of a camera on your phone, and you can find it like the direct supply chain. Next slide, please. Additionally, you can eat locally. You can buy from local markets, from farmers markets, and from farmers directly if possible. You can ask restaurants if the food that they're serving is locally sourced and where they buy their fish from. Next slide, please. You can learn more and raise awareness. So you can talk to your family and friends and see if they'll make the switch to fair trade products and learn more about the companies that you buy things from. Next slide, please. Finally, we wanted to give some additional resources that I think will be posted in the chat if you'd like to learn more. So we have some reports from the international child labor and forced labor reports, trafficking in persons report. We also have the International Labor Organization's indicators of forced labor and the FSU Public Interest Law Center's YouTube page. Next slide, please. Finally, we wanted to let everyone know that we have launched the Trial Advocacy Podcast, which is available on Spotify if you'd like to learn more about supporting survivors of human trafficking. Next slide, please. And additionally, there's our Instagram at the Human Exploitation Law Project, where you can follow along and raise your awareness that way. If you'd like to contact PILC, there's a phone number and email there as well. And now I think we may have time for a question or two. All right.
Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute myself. There we go. I don't see any additional questions in the chat. We did have a question about the age for child labor trafficking, which we answered. There's also a question about if there's an anti-labor trafficking program in Highlands County, Florida. And I'm suggesting you can contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we can put that link in there as a resource for all local anti-trafficking programs and efforts throughout the nation. So I don't see any other questions. Melody, Peyton, Danica, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. I really liked how you're able to take the idea of buying local and doing action right here, right now, because doing a big act, filing a petition is a big deal to do. But thankfully, it doesn't matter where you sit, you can make a difference in the supply chain. Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, now I'd like to open up the program to our next and final panelist. Martina Vandenberg is ready to present. Martina, thank you very much for being with us today. And thanks to all the panelists so far. I think you're going to bring us home and give us even more action steps that we can take, as well as inform us about what's going on out there.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Robin. I just want to thank you for inviting the Human Trafficking Legal Center to participate. I want to thank Finus for her guidance. And I want to congratulate the students and Danica at Florida State University, because you are on the cutting edge of forced labor remediation with work on the Tariff Act. So congratulations to you, because that really is some of the most important work that's going on around the country to eliminate forced labor and supply chains. So your presentation was wonderful. Next slide. Okay, 2 words about the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which Finus has already mentioned. Our real superpower is giving referrals to trafficking survivors for pro bono legal representation. So when we started this work 10 years ago, there were about 50 federal trafficking cases that had ever been filed. as civil cases under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act in federal courts across the United States. That number in the last 10 years has swelled to more than 500. So we do pro bono referrals for trafficking survivors. We mentor the attorneys and train them on the law. We do hard-hitting, cutting-edge research on trends and gaps and system failures. We do strategic litigation, which I'm going to talk about today. And then we do a lot of training, both of community members, but then also of the legal community. We've trained about 5,000 lawyers across the United States to handle immigration, civil, and victim witness criminal representation of trafficking survivors. Next slide. I'm going to focus on forced labor in the United States, and I want to start with criminal cases and then move to civil cases. And then I will also touch on the Tariff Act, although I feel like Danica and Peyton and Melody did such a great job. I'm going to leave that and see if there are any questions for them on those issues. So next slide, please. I want to talk about some of the cases that you don't see on the front page of the New York Times, some of the cases that are not in the public eye. And it's because they're labor trafficking cases. I hate to say it, but sex trafficking cases are sexy and they get lots of clicks on social media and on websites. And so we see reporting of forced labor cases far less often. But as Finus has explained, the trauma, the abuse, the violence, the coercion, the threats that labor trafficking victims suffer are no different in many cases from the threats and violence that victims of sex trafficking face. This is a case in Texas. Again, a lovely neighborhood, just like the one Finus described, with a fine, upstanding family. In fact, in this particular case, one of the kids grew up and went to West Point. The female perpetrator in this case, who was convicted, was the daughter of the foreign minister of her country, where she had immigrated from. Her husband, the male perpetrator in this case, he was the son of the president of his country. So they came to the United States. They built a life here in the United States, but part of the way they built that life was by bringing a child into their home to do forced labor. So this child came into their home when she was literally not even 10 years old. She was held for years and years. The neighbors said nothing. She was paid nothing. And she was held in forced labor in this lovely home, in this lovely neighborhood, and no one noticed. It wasn't until finally she was able to escape that she also was able to access the services that she needed, including dental care. One of the things that Finus mentioned was that many labor trafficking survivors never see a dentist, never have a toothbrush. Many of them walk out of houses just like this one, needing tens of thousands of dollars worth of dental care because their teeth have been allowed to rot. When I litigate these cases and when the defendants say to the court, this was just like a member of the family, I subpoena their dental records because inevitably the children of the family not only went to the dentist, they have beautiful straight teeth because they went to the orthodontist. But the trafficking victim, the child held in a modern form of slavery in a home like this one, got no dental care, got no health care whatsoever. So the defendants in this case were convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. They lost on appeal to the Fifth Circuit. But most important for me as an advocate for trafficking victims held in forced labor around the United States, the court ordered mandatory restitution. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. This is a case literally ripped from the headlines, a very recent case involving US citizen children, large numbers of US citizen children, whose parents had become members of a cult. The cult separated the children from their parents and sent them and held them in forced labor all across the United States, working in bakeries and restaurants and businesses owned by the cults. The children also did domestic servitude, and the children were not permitted to go to school. They were educated by the cult. This case was known for years. It was in Kansas City, not a place that we think of as a hub of human trafficking, but it was never prosecuted. It wasn't until last year after years of investigation and a civil case that I'll talk about, that this case was actually indicted. So this case is ongoing. Next slide, please. This is a case in North Carolina, not that far from all of you in Florida, a case of a woman who was held in a nail salon. Again, a public-facing service job where she was doing manicures and pedicures for wealthy women in Davidson, North Carolina. But she was at the same time held in debt bondage, not permitted to leave, told that she owed thousands and thousands of dollars, and also subjected to physical violence. So this, again, was one of the rare cases of forced labor that was indicted. And in this case, there was a conviction. This perpetrator was also sentenced to prison and also sentenced to pay restitution to the victim. Next slide. So this is another case that was just recently indicted at the end of last year. This is a multi-state conspiracy involving forced labor of Mexican agricultural workers. Finest talked about coming to the United States on a legal visa with a legal contract. She came with an A3 visa. These are workers who came to the United States with legal visas, the expectation that they would be doing legal work. They had contracts, they had H-2A visas. Everything looked perfectly fine, except that they were exploited and held in forced labor, according to the allegations in the indictment. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about forced labor and indictments. I just want to point out that the federal government prosecutes almost no forced labor cases. It's not that Northern Florida is some sort of outlier in terms of the lack of prosecutions. This is data that we pulled from the Trafficking in Persons report issued by the State Department each year. If you look at the numbers of prosecutions, they never go above 282. And year after year, the number of labor trafficking cases is minuscule. 18 in 2014, 9 in 2015, 13 in 2016. And looking back at 2020, just 15 cases. We don't have the data yet for 2021. We're still waiting, but we're hoping that there will be a slight uptick in forced labor prosecutions. We've been waiting a long time for this. Next slide, please. I mentioned restitution as well. One of the things that the Human Trafficking Legal Center looks at is system failures, and we have a lot of system failures to report. One of those system failures is mandatory restitution. Under the federal law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, restitution for trafficking victims is mandatory. And yet, in research that we did pro bono with Wilmer Hale, after creating an entire criminal case database of every criminal case filed since 2009, we discovered that mandatory restitution, which for me means restitution in 100% of cases where there is a conviction or a guilty plea, what we discovered is that restitution is ordered in 27% of cases under those circumstances. Next slide, please. The restitution law at the federal level is actually excellent. And when the US government brings a case under the TVPRA, the restitution statute 1593 basically says that any worker must recover all of their back wages. And we have excellent case law indicating that that also includes Fair Labor Standards Act liquidated damages. In a sex trafficking case, it would be hugely problematic to say we're going to pay you $7.25 an hour as a child being raped in commercial sex. And so the law for sex trafficking restitution under the federal statute is that you recover whatever the value was to the defendant. So the law is well crafted. It is just observed in the breach in most cases. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about civil litigation for trafficking survivors. Next slide, please. What we have seen in the absence of prosecutions for trafficking, particularly forced labor trafficking, is trafficking survivors who are bringing their own cases in the US federal courts. And the law that we use is 18 USC 1595. Interestingly enough, it's embedded in the middle of the criminal code. And so the law that I rely on to sue traffickers in federal court draws upon all of the statutes that federal prosecutors are using or could use to provide criminal prosecution of these same defendants. And so we're bringing the cases in many instances, and the pro bono attorneys we train are bringing the cases in many instances that the federal government and federal prosecutors have failed to bring. This is not just in the United States, this is actually a trend across the globe. Next slide. So I want to start with the case that I mentioned out of Kansas City. This is a headline from the New York Times from just a couple of years ago. This was one of the survivors of that forced labor conspiracy in the cult. This young woman who sued under her own name courageously is named Kendra Ross. And Kendra Ross sued the cult. She sued the leader of the cult. She sued the family members. She sued the co-conspirators. She went to federal court by herself and took on this entire trafficking ring. She was represented pro bono by McGuire Woods, by an amazing lawyer named Betsy Hudson, and a legal team at McGuire Woods, all working pro bono, all working for free. The case went before a federal judge. There was a default judgment, and the judge ordered $8 million in damages for back wages, for liquidated damages, for emotional distress, and also for punitive damages, which are a very important part of the civil damages that we include in these remedies. Next slide, please. This looks like a sex trafficking case, right? This is a human trafficking case where she brought a case against a hotel, but this is actually a forced labor case. This is another survivor. This is her picture, Lisa Riccio. She also courageously sued under her own name, although in many cases we sue as Jane Doe. It's completely the decision of the survivor whether to proceed in her own name or to proceed under a pseudonym. In this particular instance, the trafficker tricked her into coming. He told her that he was sick, and as a friend, he wanted her to come and visit him. She went to visit. He locked her in a hotel room. He spent a week abusing her physically and sexually in order to put her in commercial sex. She was able to run away before she ended up in forced prostitution, so there was no commercial sex and there were no clients. But she fought and fought. She managed to get the trafficker convicted by the state for a lesser crime. And then, with the assistance of Wilmer Hale, working pro bono, she sued the motel where she had been held, alleging that the trafficker and the motel were in cahoots, that they had conspired and that they had done this before. The case was originally dismissed. It went up on appeal to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, where Justice Souter, sitting by designation, wrote a brilliant opinion in the Riccio versus Patel case, finding that sexual servitude, forced sexual labor, is a form of forced labor and involuntary servitude, and that this case could go forward with a theory of attempted sex trafficking and also forced labor and involuntary servitude. The case went back down. It was remanded by the First Circuit Court of Appeals, went back down to the trial court in Massachusetts, went to trial before a jury. On the very first day of the trial, Lisa Riccio testified, and the case was resolved that very day for an undisclosed amount. Next slide, please. This is a case, again, never prosecuted. Really, none of these cases have been prosecuted until the cult case was just prosecuted late last year. This is a case of an American diplomat. Finest talked about foreign diplomats and the diplomat from Malawi who trafficked her into forced labor. This is an American diplomat and her Australian diplomat husband, accused not once, but twice, of trafficking domestic workers from Ethiopia into their housing units attached to the US Embassy while they were posted abroad serving the US government. The Australian diplomat husband, who was retired, would stay home all day with the domestic workers and sexually abuse them. These women were also held in forced labor. This occurred the first time in Yemen and then again in Japan. Both of those cases were brought as pro bono cases. The first case involving the survivor from Japan, brought by Jenner and Block, pro bono. The second case brought pro bono by Jones Day. In both cases, the judge, and in the second case, the jury, found for the victim. In the first case involving the victim in Japan, the award was $3 million. The jury similarly awarded approximately $3.3 million in damages. This case was never prosecuted. This is a case involving severe sexual violence as well as forced labor committed by a US diplomat serving abroad. So I think this should give us pause to wonder what is not being prosecuted. Next slide, please. We have done a report on 15 years of civil litigation. We track every single case ever filed. We have a database of every civil case ever filed in the US federal courts under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. That database is free and open to pro bono attorneys and open to plaintiff side attorneys who are working on trafficking cases. Next slide, please. The cases have increased since we published the report. This is the chart from the report that we published after 15 years. Then the law passed in 2003, so the report was published in 2018. One thing that may surprise you, though, is that the number of cases, the plurality of cases, 106 of the 402 cases that had been filed as of the 15th anniversary were domestic servitude cases. It is domestic workers who are leading the way in holding traffickers accountable in civil cases in the federal courts in the United States. Next slide, please. I'm going to switch gears very briefly. I feel like Danica and her team did such an excellent job talking about the Tariff Act already. I'm just going to touch on this very, very briefly in the few minutes that I have remaining. The only reason that I want to mention this is we actually created a guide. And so if you are interested in learning more about how to file a petition, we created a guide called Importing Freedom Using the US Tariff Act to Combat Forced Labor in Global Supply Chains. It's available on our website, and happily, it's also available on the forced labor homepage of Customs and Border Protection. So Customs and Border Protection has taken the guide and posted it on their website as a guide for people who are considering filing petitions. I just want to give you one very potent case example that I think attests to the power of this remedy. Many of you have followed the abuse of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Uyghurs held in forced labor. There is consensus that the Uyghurs are also being subjected to genocide in Xinjiang province in China. And so a group of non-governmental organizations, including the Human Trafficking Legal Center, filed a petition with Customs and Border Protection demanding that all cotton from Xinjiang be blocked from entering US markets. And remarkably, in January 2021, the federal government, Customs and Border Protection, ordered a withhold release order blocking all cotton from Xinjiang from entering the US market. Just to give you a sense of how powerful this is, Secretary Mayorkas of the Department of Homeland Security spoke this week at a White House cabinet level meeting on human trafficking. He reported that last year, the US government blocked 1,550 shipments of goods allegedly made with forced labor at a value of $500 million. That's $500 million worth of goods that exporters intended to send to the United States, that importers here in the United States were waiting to obtain. $500 million worth of goods blocked at the port. That does not even begin to touch the number of ships that were turned around. And so some importers just decide, and some shippers and factories just decide it's not worth it. And instead of docking at the United States as intended, they will reroute the ships and reroute the goods, transship them to another market. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of how things are going this year, Mayorkas said this week that the government detained 1,550 shipments in the entire fiscal year of 2021. But in the first quarter of 2022, they had already detained 912 shipments, which means we are on track for a massive number of detentions in 2022. So this is, again, I think a testament to how powerful this tool is and how important it is that the legal clinic in Florida is working on it. Next slide, please. We've left time for questions. Next slide, please. This is just a picture that we use from one of the protests in New York, just showing that These are workers, and this is an issue of workers' rights. Next slide, please. And this is the contact information, both for Finus and for me, and also for the Human Trafficking Legal Center. So that's, I think, the entire deck. I think, Robin, we can take the deck down, and I'm happy to field any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Martina. I mean, that was just such a great example of what you can do, you know, who's out there, whether it's the large law firms that are representing individuals. And as we talked earlier, what you could do as an individual yourself and your consuming habits, but also just knowledge, knowing what's going on out there, demanding accountability from your local representatives, knowing that this is happening, and really paying attention to labor trafficking. The fact that it's out there and we have to, you know, scour, you know, local news here and there to figure it out is really shameful on us, I think, as a society. Because this is the bedrock of who we are. How are we providing for people, and how are people earning a living and being able to survive in society with a fair wage and a shot? So yeah, let's open it up. I want to let you all know I've posted the CLE credit information for you all. 2 hours of credit from the Florida Bar are available. And if you have any questions for Martina or any of our presenters, please let us know. Put it in the chat. I mean, and I'll start out. Nobody has nothing's come in at the moment, but can I ask Finus and Martina, from a national point of view, are you hopeful? I mean, what do you see happening in terms of this issue of labor trafficking? And do you have anything specific you could tell us, like, we really need you to do this? And I'd really hearken to any of the lawyers who are on. If you're able to take these cases, should lawyers be in touch with the Human Trafficking Legal Center directly? What would be next steps we can actually do to take action?
So Finus, I think I'll jump in, and then I'm going to hand the baton to you because I know you have ideas on this as well. So if lawyers are interested in doing pro bono legal work on human trafficking cases, they can certainly contact the Human Trafficking Legal Center. We never know where cases will be referred for us to place. Our methodology is that we like to make sure that trafficking survivors are completely surrounded by the kind of wraparound services that are provided by STAC, so that someone has a case manager and that all of their immediate needs are met. Because as all of you know, doing civil litigation, going to court for someone who's a trafficking survivor is incredibly traumatic. One of the lawyers I worked with as local counsel in a case involving a woman who had been trafficked and held in forced labor for 19 years by 2 physicians in Wisconsin. This local counsel said to me, civil litigation is like inviting a wild animal to live in your house until the case is over. It's there with you at breakfast, it's there with you at dinner, it's in bed with you at night. So thinking of civil litigation as something that's both traumatic, but also potentially incredibly empowering. So I do hope that lawyers who are interested will contact us. We're happy to do trainings on pro bono issues. And the other thing I'll just add briefly before I hand off to Finus, it's not all about civil litigation. We have trafficking survivors with family law issues. We have trafficking survivors with tax issues. We have trafficking survivors with bankruptcy issues. I sometimes joke that the trafficking survivors who come are incredibly courageous, but they arrive with a buffet of legal needs. And so in some cases, you need an army of lawyers to do the immigration piece and the family law piece and the custody piece and all of the needs on the legal side. So that's I think a synopsis, but Finus, do you have anything to add about what people can do and whether you see hope on the horizon?
People need to educate themselves, follow our instincts. Don't rely on a victim to reach out, because when you are trafficked, sometimes we don't even know, like, I couldn't speak English. And I was relying with the community, like you and everybody out there, to do something. So don't ask questions. So for instance, when somebody was able to ask me questions, where am I from? Like, are you okay in my language? First of all, I find out where people are from, especially like people who doesn't speak English, they don't know anybody, write down in their language, like, are you okay? You'll be surprised that person responding in their language. I need help, just simple as that. And also donate to like NGO organization like HTLC who are like walking the walk, okay? We don't just talk, but we take action, walking the walk. We don't get like our grant from the, government. So that means we lie with the community to donate. So that's why I have a job right now. So HTLC do not just, refer me to Jones Day, but also they provide me an opportunity, provide me opportunity to have a job to work. And last but not least, of course, take action. When you see something doesn't look right, call the hotline. Don't think twice. Look somebody's eyes. Like when you walk outside, like meeting people, know exactly like, oh, this person is having a bad day. This person, something's wrong. So don't expect somebody like a victim to say somebody, we need help. Look people's eyes. There's this phrase say like every face tells a story. I believe that every face tells a story because you can know like that, like when somebody's having a bad day or somebody's happy. So as simple as that, action is powerful than words. Thank you.
Absolutely. Action is powerful. I'm putting the link to the National Human Trafficking Hotline up there too, so people can have all that information for that 24/7 multilingual resource. And Martina, a question did come in, which I know this is something you talk about a lot, which is why aren't federal prosecutors not filing mandatory restitution for all cases? So what do we have to do to kind of move that issue forward?
Okay, so I have one message to federal prosecutors, which is trafficking survivors need lawyers. I don't care whether they're sex trafficking survivors or labor trafficking survivors. They need lawyers as victim witnesses. And I think what prosecutors will learn is that actually having a victim who's represented is helpful, not harmful, because there are resources that a pro bono lawyer can bring to the table in helping file a restitution petition. Right? In some cases, it's not the prosecutors, right? In some cases, it's the judges who say, this is illegal work, or literally we had one judge who said, no, I don't think so. This is prostitution. I don't think so. The people that we have found are least likely to get any restitution are child victims of sex trafficking. Ironically, the people who are most likely to get restitution are victims of forced labor. And I do think that there is actually some definite causation there, because trafficking victims who are victims of forced labor are more likely to be foreign born. For that reason, they are more likely to have immigration counsel. For that reason, their immigration counsel is more likely to do victim witness advocacy for them with the prosecutors and fight for restitution. So when I'm doing victim witness advocacy on a case and I talk to the prosecutor, at our first meeting, I'm asking them whether they're thinking about restitution. And, I make my own calculation of what restitution should be. I compare notes with the prosecutor. If we have a distance between those two numbers, we try and figure out why. But, I think, Robin, that the advocacy community has relied on prosecutors to do this for too long. And I think we just need to step up and realize that this is on us. And every case that we are on, we have to push the prosecutor for restitution.
Well, and then it also harkens back, doesn't it, to the idea that human trafficking is about greed, it's about exploitation, it's about money. And why is it that when it comes to making the victims whole, all of a sudden we forget about that, or that's just secondary? And I don't mean necessarily, again, just on the prosecutor side. It is just something I think as a society we don't always think about. And how do you make a victim whole after the kind of trauma that they've endured, right? So it all goes around. Now we're at 3:32, which is 2 minutes past our end time. I don't see any other questions here. If you have them, you've gotten contact information from everybody. I just want to say thank you again. Finest Lapinga, thank you for your advocacy, your bravery, your story. You're informing us. It's so great to be with you today. Thank you very much. Martina, thank you very much for all you've done and continue to do in leading the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Encourage everybody to get involved and to check out your website and all the great resources, which we've posted a couple times in the chat. I'd like to thank Danica, Harley, and all of the, and Melody and Peyton for your advocacy over the years and on this program today. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much for what you do. Thank you to the FSU College of Law and to Legal Services of North Florida, which, by the way, is another resource. I know we have a couple of lawyers from LSNF on the call here today. They do that work, Martina, that you mentioned, the family law, the identity theft, the benefits advocacy, all the things that survivors need, and we work with them all the time. So thank you to LSNF and to all of you for attending. Again, the CLE information is there. If you have any questions, I'll put my email real fast in here, but please feel free to follow up, and we hope to see you. By the way, I put our STAC website in there. We have a training for all businesses and workplaces that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Please, please, please pre-register for that training. It's going to be free online and very informative about what you can do as an employee or a manager or any kind of business or workplace. So with that, I'll say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for all your work, and take care. Bye-bye.